Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So as always, just a massive thank you to everyone who's joined. To all the new subs, welcome. My name is Silhouette. I try and post my content every Friday. Sometimes it doesn't work out for that because of work schedules and whatnot. But if you just pin your notifications bell, then you'll always be notified as when I'm posting. But I just want to thank you all for giving me a chance. To everyone who's been watching since day one, welcome back. Thank you. So, with all that said and done, we're going to be looking at the case of Gordon Cummins. So, continuing on from last week's theme, this is a story that was again compared to Jack the Ripper, and Gordon was actually called the Blackout Ripper. Mainly because he operated during World War II London. And during that time, obviously, London experienced quite a lot of blackouts, hence the name. So, with all that said and done, we're going to get into the story of Gordon Cummins. So, as always, we like to start from the beginning. So, who was Gordon Cummins? Gordon Frederick Cummins, he was born on the 18th of February 1914, and this was in Earswick in Yorkshire. His parents were John and Amelia Cummins, and Gordon was the oldest of their four children. So John worked as a civil servant, and this was basically he ran a school for what was described as troubled children at the time, like a boarding school. And Amelia, she was just a stay-at-home housewife, which was very common at the time for women. And as a child, Gordon, he was actually privately educated in Llandough in South Wales. And his teachers described him as unremarkable, and said he was a lot happier socialising than he was studying. However, Gordon did manage to gain a diploma in chemistry, and this was when he was 16. So he eventually leaves the school in 1930 and he attends Northampton College of Technology. But he leaves after just only 2 years on the 1st of November 1932. And at the age of 18, Gordon moves to Newcastle, where he got a job as an industrial chemist. But he was fired after only 5 months at this post, and this was in August 1933. And not long after, he begins working as a tanner in Northampton. But again, he was fired from this after 15 months. And this was just basically down to him and his poor timekeeping. So he then flits between jobs and he works as a casual labourer up until October of 1934. And he relocates to London and begins working as a leather dresser in a clothing factory. And this job earns him around £3 a week. Now, let's not forget, obviously, the currency back then was a lot different, as I'm going to get into in a little bit with some of the currency. This was quite a lot of money back in those days, so he was doing okay in this job. So he continues with this firm to train as a foreman. And whilst living in London, Gordon suddenly decides that he wants to live as an aristocrat. He often visits hotels and bars, and this is all around the West End of London. And he makes false claims that he's a son, like the illegitimate son of a peer. A peer was seen as someone who was really, really high up in society. And he therefore received a weekly allowance of however much he said. So it wasn't clarified how much he told people that he was getting, but it made out that he was getting a substantial amount, mainly because he was a son of someone really important. Now, to try and obviously convince people of this, Gordon had refined his accent to imitate the Oxford accent. He then gives himself the title Honourable Gordon Cummins. So in the meantime of trying to live out this facade, he's trying to make a living out of making thefts and embezzlements. He bragged to colleagues about his sex life, so he was using this as a way to hook up with women around the West End. And in his employer's mind, the extravagant lifestyle impacted his work life, and he eventually was fired from his position on the 8th of February 1935. So Gordon then moves into his brother's house in Queen Mews in Bayswater, and this is basically for him to figure out his next move. And the month later, Gordon joins the RAF and he enlists at the reception centre in Regent's Park. This is obviously where new recruits are assessed for training. So he initially trains as a rigger, and he's tasked with undertaking flight checks on aircraft. And to his superiors, Gordon, he come across as really ambitious, but they noticed that he boasted quite a lot about his life, and this made him really, really unpopular with his colleagues. Really unpopular with his colleagues and the servicemen, and they actually nicknamed him the Duke in a way to take the piss out of him. Now, in May 1936, Gordon meets a woman named Marjorie Stevens. Now, Marjorie worked as a theatre producer and a secretary, and they met during a Empire Air Day show in Hemlow, and this is in Bedfordshire. And after 7 months of dating, they marry at Paddington Registry Office on the 28th of December 1936. Now, initially, Gordon is stationed with the Marine and Armament Experimental Establishment in Felixstowe. And between 36 and 39, he's relocated with the military research team to Scotland. On the 25th of October 1939, so this is right at the beginning of World War II, Gordon was transferred to Helensburgh in Scotland, and he stayed here for the next 2 years, and that's when he transferred to Wiltshire. Now, at Wiltshire, he reached junior aircraftsman rank, so he was doing quite well within his position. He was getting somewhere with it. And he said that he had aspirations to be a Spitfire pilot. Now, in November of 1941, Gordon was then sent to Cornwall, and here his bragging earned him another nickname, the Count. And while stationed in this place, he joined a social club called the Blue Peter Club, and he occasionally helped out on the bar. Now, eventually, the landlady, she discovered that £35 worth of her jewellery was missing, and from her apartment. And although she suspected Gordon, she believed it was Gordon, she couldn't obviously point the finger and blame. She had no evidence. As don't forget, obviously CCTV wasn't a thing these days, and obviously police, as we find out, they had to trawl through tons and tons of paperwork. In January of 1942, Gordon now accrued over £1,000 hours of flying experience. He sits an exam for aviation, and he actually passed with flying colours. The aircrew receiving centre in Regent's Park stationed him with over 300 other men, and he was told to report for his first duty flying the plane at 10 a.m. on the 2nd of February 1942. Now, Gordon was known to have murdered 4 women over a 6-day period in 1942, but he was only suspected of... So he was only actually convicted of murdering 1 of these women, and he was suspected of murdering 2 others in October of 1941. And his known victims were said to be sex workers who he met in bars around the West End. And all of the murders were carried out during the wartime blackouts, which were given the nickname the Blackout Ripper. So his first suspected victim was a 19-year-old clerk called Maple Churchyard, and this was on the 13th of October 1931. Now, Maple was known to meet servicemen for casual sex, So she wasn't actually clarified to be a sex worker. They just said that she would hook up with him for a casual meeting. So her body is found by workmen in a bombed house in Hempstead Road, and this was just a day later. She had been strangled to death by her own knickers, and a pathologist examining her said that the killer was left-handed, and this was suggested to by the bruises on her neck. Her handbag had been emptied and some of its contents had been stolen, and it was said that there was basically no sign of any sexual assault, and her time of death was said to have been 9:15 at night on the previous evening. On the 17th of October in 1941, the body of a 48-year-old widow called Edith Eleanor Humphreys was found in her bed in her Regent's Park home. She was actually still alive when she was found, but she was only just. She had been beaten around the head and the face, she'd been strangled, she had her throat cut, and she had been stabbed in the head, and this wound in her head was so deep it actually penetrated her brain, so I'm kind of surprised that she was still alive at this point. Her front door was said to have been found ajar, but there was no sign of forced entry. There were several pieces of jewellery that had been stolen, and Edith was later taken to hospital where she later died. Now, at the time of these two murders, Gordon was actually stationed in Cologne, and he was known to stay at St John's Wood, and this place was really, really close to Maple's address, and literally just around the corner from Edith, and he was known to go to St John's Wood while he was on annual leave. Now, on Sunday the 8th of February 1942, Gordon leaves his RAF establishment in St John's Wood to see his wife in Southwark. At 6 p.m, he tells his wife of plans to go get frequent some bars in the West End, and he takes a £1 note. So back in these days, banknotes, there was a £1 note. That equates to around £40 in today's money. Whereas, today, a round of drinks in a pub, I don't know, for example, say 5-6 people, round of drinks probably would come to £40. Back in those days, when it was like 6p a pint or something, imagine how bladdered you could get. And he leaves his wife's address at 6:30. On the 9th of February, the next day, the body of a 41-year-old pharmacist, Evelyn Hamilton, was discovered by an electrician named Harold Batchelor. She was found in an air raid shelter in Marylebone. Her clothes had been disarranged and a scarf had been tied around her head. She had scuff marks on her shoes. There were broken pieces of mortar scattered around her body. And this suggested that Evelyn had put up a really strong fight, but it wasn't one that she was able to win, unfortunately. Her skirt had been pulled up, her underwear pulled down, her top had been torn, and this was exposing one of her breasts. Her handbag and around £80 in cash had been stolen, and some of its contents were thrown outside, but the police couldn't find any fingerprints. Her body was then taken to the mortuary to be examined, and the only person that was able to come and identify her body was her landlady, who was able to. So the day before she died was actually her 41st birthday, and Evelyn had resigned from her pharmacy post in Hornchurch. So Hornchurch is a little town on the outskirts of East London in Essex, so not that far from where I'm living. I know Hornchurch like the back of my hand. My grandparents lived there for many, many years. Big part of my childhood. I go down there every now and then. Not much has changed with it from what I remember when I was a kid. But it's an area that I know really, really well. Now, the pharmacy was actually facing a real hardship, mainly because of the war, and it was due to be closed down. So Evelyn had quit as she actually got a job, been offered a job in Grimsby, and she told a friend of hers that day that she was planning to leave London to move to Lincolnshire. She was last seen by a waitress in Marble Arch celebrating her birthday, drinking a glass of white wine. And it's believed that she was attacked as she walked home, and her post mortem showed she had been strangled by a left handed individual. She hadn't been sexually assaulted or mutilated, apart from a few scratches on her breast and a cut above her eyebrow. On 8:30 a.m. on the 10th of February, two meter readers they discover the naked, mutilated body of a 34-year-old woman named Evelyn Oakley. Now, obviously, because the previous victim was called Evelyn, this one's called Evelyn, I'm going to refer to her by her full name just to save the confusion. She was lying in her bed at 153 Wardour Street in Soho. She had been beaten and strangled unconscious before having her throat cut, and this actually left a 6-inch wound, and this had severed her carotid artery. Now, Evelyn Oakley's head would lay hanging off of her bed. Her abdomen and thighs and genitals had been mutilated by a razor blade and a tin opener. This was estimated to have been inflicted after her death, and there were deep wounds inflicted to her vaginal cavity, and this suggested where the tin opener had been used. An electric torch was then pushed inside of her vagina, and on the floor was a set of curling tongs covered in blood. A razor blade was left next to her head, and her handbag contents were then thrown onto the floor. In a nightstand, there were another 7 unused razor blades. And it was said that her door had been closed but not locked. Now, looking at the tools used and the position of the wounds, it was ascertained again to be someone left-handed. And despite the fingerprints that were found actually being matched, the police record didn't hold any of these. So it suggested that whoever had done this wasn't known to the police at the time. It could have been anyone who was new to the area or was taking some sort of revenge, that they couldn't work it out. What they were aware of was that they were all looking for the same person. Now, Evelyn Oakley was said to have been a married woman, and at the start of World War II, she had turned to sex work using the name Nita Ward to boost her income. She worked as a nightclub host, and 3 eyewitnesses later said that they said that they had seen her talking to a young, clean-shaven man, but he also had a mustache, he had chestnut hair. They described him as an airman. He was around 5'8", and bizarrely, Gordon at this particular time he was 28 and stood at around 5'7". They said that they overheard Evelyn ask her sexual preferences. He asked Evelyn about her sexual preferences. Sorry, and she had replied something, and he said that he likes blonde women, and she was last seen alive by another tenant on her block, and this lady was called Ivy. And Ivy said that she saw Evelyn Oakley at the stairwell at 11:40 p.m. with a man matching the same description. And Ivy said that she was woken by the increased volume of Evelyn's wireless radio, but she didn't go out of her room to investigate. In the early hours of Wednesday, the 11th of February, Gordon meets another sex worker, a lady called Margaret Lowe, who was 43. and they go back to her flat in 11 Gosfield Street in Marylebone. Now, Margaret was last seen by her neighbour, a lady called Florence, at 1:15 a.m. walking down the corridor with Gordon. And Florence later said that she heard him leave whistling to himself. And Margaret's body actually lay undiscovered for the next 2 days. On the 13th of February, her 15-year-old daughter Barbara, she's popped over out of the blue, and she's come to obviously visit her mother, and she was told by another neighbour that Margaret hasn't actually been seen for at least 2 or 3 days, and that there was a parcel waiting for her for around the same amount of time. So Margaret's body was eventually found on her bed, and she was still under a quilt, and the quilt had been pulled up to her chin. She was laid on her back, her legs had been opened, and knees bent upwards. Now, she had been beaten as much as she could have been. It was actually described as completely excessive and unneeded. She was then she was strangled with her stocking, and this was still knotted beneath the right side of her jaw. And it was said that despite being 2 days since she'd been laying there, froth was actually still visible from around her mouth. Now, when examining her body, the pathologist, Sir Bernard Spilsbury, he remarked that the injuries sustained were quite dreadful, and said that the person responsible was a savage sex maniac who indulged in a wicked lust to perpetrate the most diabolical injuries on the women he killed. Now, Margaret's injuries were said to have been surpassed to those that were inflicted on the previous victims, and estimated that most of them had been caused while Margaret was still alive. But after she had died, her body had been slashed with multiple instruments, all that were left still in her body. These included a razor blade, a vegetable knife, a butcher's knife, and a fireplace poker. Margaret's abdomen had been opened up, and this basically exposed all of her organs. The right side of her groin, there was a 10-inch opening, and the bread knife was still embedded within this opening, and bizarrely a candle had been pushed into her vagina. And while he had opened up her abdomen, he had also damaged her uterus. And again, fingerprints were found at the scene, particularly on a candle holder and a bottle of stout. The prints on the candle holder and the stout, they were proved to be from the left hand, again indicating that the killer was left-handed. Margaret was said to have been a widowed mother of one. So her husband had reportedly died in 1932, and they had originally lived in Southend-on-Sea. And following her husband's death, Margaret sold her businesses and placed her daughter into a boarding school. Margaret then moved to London, and initially she had got employed as a house cleaner, but then she began using sex work and used the name Peggy Campbell. And within her new life, she only ever saw her daughter every third weekend, which was obviously the weekend that her daughter had come to visit her. And unfortunately, she never got to see her mum. On February the 12th, Gordon meets another sex worker called Catherine Mulcahy, and she was using the name Kathleen King. Now, Catherine was aged 25 at the time. She agrees to take Gordon back to her flat in Southwick Street. Gordon then pays her £2, and again to a taxi, so £2 would have been equated to about £80 in today's money. They enter, Catherine lights up a fire, and she begins undressing. But bizarrely, she leaves her boots on. Now, she looks over at Gordon, and he's sitting there with a real strange smile on his face, and he beckons her to come over and join him. So the two get on the bed. Gordon undresses and he climbs on top of Catherine. He then does like a weird, bizarre jump and actually slams his knees into her stomach and begins strangling her. However, he underestimates Catherine. She falls back hard and she manages to kick him in the stomach and kicks him off her, sorry. And as Gordon falls to the floor, Catherine manages to run to a neighbour's house. So, in all the panic in the midst, Gordon then starts formulating a plan into his head. He gets quickly dressed. He goes and finds Catherine, who's in obviously a terrible state at this point, and he says that he's sorry. He's had a lot to drink, and he gives her a further 8 £1 notes. And Catherine, all the while, she's screaming that he was a murderer and get him away from her. So he then grabs his coat and leaves, and he, not realising, he had left his RAF issue belt behind in Catherine's. So later on that night, Gordon then meets a 32-year-old Doris Jeanette. She's operating under the name Olga. So she's last seen at 10:20 p.m. And this is obviously on the same night that Gordon attacked Catherine. And Doris is last seen by her friend Beatrice, who had actually been having a drink with Doris in a tea room. Now, according to Beatrice, Doris had actually planned to visit a regular client, and this man she referred to as Captain. And Beatrice and Doris then parted ways on Oxford Street, and this is when Doris meets Gordon. She takes him back to her house as she shared with her husband Henry, 187 Sussex Gardens. Now, Doris, she was only known to occasionally do sex work. So she had married Henry in 1935, and he was said to have been quite elderly at this point, but he was one of her regular clients when she was doing sex work full time. She explained that she only needed to do it when she needed a few extra shillings, and this was to supplement the money given by Henry, who at this particular point, despite him being elderly, he was a manager of a hotel in Sloane Square, and she would only engage in sex work when he had to stay overnight in the hotel. On the 13th of February, Henry returns home and he notices that the bedroom door is locked. He's calling out for Doris. Doris isn't answering, and Henry then calls the police out of panic. And they send out a young policeman called William Payne. So William tells Henry to basically stay in the hallway, and eventually William successfully manages to gain entry to the bedroom. He turns on the light and he finds Doris on her bed wearing a black nightgown that was ripped open to show her naked body. She was laying across the bed at a weird angle. Her left hand was placed between her thighs. A stocking had been tied around her neck. Her abdomen, breasts, genitals, and her thighs had been mutilated. One wound was said to be a 6-inch gash that went from her navel to her crotch, a 6.5-inch wound to her vagina, and flesh had actually been cut away from under her left breast, and her jaw had been broken. The knife that was used was actually left laying on her thigh. So William, he obviously, understandably, he exits the room and he instructs Henry not to enter at whatever cost. And he runs back to the station to call Scotland Yard for backup. And Division Detective Leonard Clark then arrives and examines the scene. And he discovers that all that's missing from the house is a watch and £5. And they also find 2 used condoms on the floor. So Bernard Spilsbury led this autopsy as well, and he concluded that Doris had been strangled to the point of death before her breasts were mutilated, and that the rest of the mutilation had occurred after her death. He said that the murder showed a degree of restraint above the navel, and then whoever had killed her had worked himself into an absolute frenzy below the navel. Now, due to the wartime restrictions on newspapers, the murders were only reported very limitedly, but they were prime topic for the sex workers, who they were basically now really reluctant to go with anyone at a particular time who wasn't considered a regular client. And when the press did report on the murders, Gordon was just referred to as the Blackout killer, the Blackout Ripper, sorry. So obviously, at this particular point, they're still waiting on any more information. But because of obviously everything going on in the world at that particular time, main focus was World War Two. And obviously the attitudes towards sex workers at this particular time wasn't a positive one. They were viewed very negatively. As I stated in last week's video, a lot of the times it was, oh, who's going to care about a dead prostitute? On the 13th of February 42, Gordon then accosts a young woman named Margaret Hayward in Piccadilly, and he takes her out. They share a sandwich and have a drink at the London Tracerdo. They then walk to Haymarket. Margaret said at this part, Gordon become unpleasantly forward towards her, and he pushes her into a doorway. And he's asking her to hug him, kiss him, touch him, whatnot. And he's groping her thighs, groping her waist. And so she said that she agreed to kiss him, and just kiss him, and that was it. And he asked her to go to an air raid shelter with him. She says no, and Gordon then begins fondling her. Margaret pushes him away, and she tries to leave. Gordon then grabs her by the throat, and he strangles her into unconsciousness. He mutters, "You won't," into her ear, and Margaret passes out. So while she's passed out, Gordon then begins looking through her handbag, and he's disturbed by an 18-year-old boy called John Shrine, who was delivering some beer to the captain's cabin pub that was nearby, and Gordon flees the scene. He flees in such a panic that he actually leaves his RAF issue gas mask and haversack behind. So John then comes to Margaret's aid and notices that she's starting to come round, and he then takes her to a hospital. And en route, they come across a policeman called PC James Skinner, who then takes them to a police station to give a statement before he takes them to the hospital. And the reason they do this is usually because the events at that particular time are still fresh in the mind. They want to get as much detail as they can before you forget anything. So obviously we were all thinking, oh, they could have just took her to the hospital, but it's a lot easier for them to do it straight away, just to get as much information to try and find this person. So after his attack on Margaret, Gordon then goes to another local pub, and this is where he realises that he's actually left his gas mark in his haversack, and he realises that the numbers printed on these could then be traced back to him. So he starts formulating a plan in his mind and starts thinking how he's going to get out of this one. So he believes that the best way to do it, he's going to steal another man's gas mug and haversack, and then return back to his base. Now, prior to providing his evidence, John had actually handed the gas mask and the haversack to the investigators. He tells them that he found them at the site. Margaret herself described those items to officers. DS Thomas Shepherd then takes note of the regiment number that's printed on them. This was 525987, and he contacts the RAF police. And in their turn, they contact the Regent's Park Regiment where Gordon was based. A sergeant then really quickly clarifies that they had been issued to Gordon Cummins. However, Gordon was actually not in his living quarters at this particular moment. So on the 14th of February, DS Shepherd, he goes to the regiment to question Gordon. Now, Gordon, predictably, he's protesting innocence. And he says that he's actually been in the volunteer pub in Baker Street that particular time. He had been drinking whiskey and bitter. Asked if anyone could clarify this, he says that he was actually with another serviceman, but he couldn't remember this man's name. He then tells DS Shepherd that he left the bar to go to Shaftesbury Avenue to drink some shots before getting into a conversation with a woman, but he claims to have really few recollections of this conversation due to being drunk. But he remembers walking down the street with her and realised that he was breaking his curfew, and he then immediately comes back to the base. So DS Shepherd then noticed cuts and bruises on his knuckles. Then he questions Gordon about this, and Gordon just basically says that he got them from doing maintenance work on the planes. Gordon then provides a written account of these events, and not long after, obviously the police, they see right through this, and he's actually arrested and held on remand for grievous bodily harm. The next day, the police examined the living quarters and the passbook, which Gordon had reportedly said that he come back on 10:30 p.m. on all of these dates. But they noticed that many of these had actually been written in pencil, so in their head, these easily could have been forged. Now, and it was also said that some of these entries were actually incomplete. Now, when speaking to other servicemen, they said that they always would vouch for one another, but they noted that Gordon had been extravagant within his spending that particular week. And it was discovered that Gordon and another serviceman called Felix Sampson would actually escape through the fire escape at midnight and not return until the early hours of the morning. The police, they then searched Gordon's possessions, and all of these showed traces of blood and brick dust, which was the same that was found on the scene of Evelyn Hamilton's murder. And he had also stolen property belonging to the victims. This included a white cigarette case engraved with LW, and this had belonged to Evelyn Oatley. And there was also a picture of Evelyn Oatley's mother that was found. Detective Chief Superintendent Fred Sherrill, he then matched the prints of the mirror and the tin opener at Evelyn Oatley's murder to those of Gordon. And this particularly was Gordon's left thumb and his little finger. And two of the £1 notes that were given to Catherine Malachi, they were found to be brand new, and the police traced the serial numbers and found that they had actually been issued to Gordon on the 12th of February 1942. Now, that's quite significant because it's the exact same way that the police were able to track down the Yorkshire Ripper when they were looking for him. If you remember rightly, like there was a £5 note that had been paid to one of the victims, and using the serial number because it was brand new, they were able to trace it back to Peter Sutcliffe. Now, Margaret Hayward and Catherine were then asked to attend an identity parade. Catherine said that she was unable to give a positive ID. However, Margaret, without any hesitation, she picks Gordon out. Now, Gordon continues to plead his innocence. He said that Margaret was really confused and that basically another serviceman has switched his gas mask and haversack to actually frame him, which is an explanation that a 6-year-old would give, not a 28-year-old man, but there we go. Now, the police, obviously, they don't believe him. They know he's bullshitting, and they send him to Brixton, HMP Brixton on remand. And the detective who traced the banknotes, his name was Edward Greenough, then goes to the prison on the 16th of February to formally interview Gordon. And he recounts all of his movements on the days between the 9th and the 13th of February. He's adamant and insists that he never met any of the women. He said that he didn't recognise any of their photos. When presented with their personal possessions, police had found in his room, Gordon said that the items had been taken from a respirator case that he was carrying when arrested, but the case wasn't actually his. He sticks to the story of having the wrong gas mark and haversack. And Edward, he wasn't convinced either. So he charges him with the murders of Evelyn Oatley, Margaret Lowe, and Doris Jeanette. And on the 20th of February, he's charged with assaulting Margaret and Catherine. And then there's like a time lapse for about a month. They have to present all of this evidence to the court, and Gordon then stands before a judge by magistrate's court, and this is where he's formally charged with Evelyn Hamilton's murder. And like I said at the beginning of the video, he was only actually, despite being proved to have killed 4, 2 of them obviously he was never proven to have killed, but he was only ever charged with 1. I couldn't find out any reason why he was only charged with 1 of the murders. So Gordon's trial for Evelyn Oatley begins on the 24th of February 1942, and this was at the Old Bailey, and preceded by Justice Asquith. And Gordon enters a plea of not guilty. So the prosecution consisted of a man called Travers Christmas Humphreys. He was actually infamous for presiding over the cases of Ruth Ellis and Derek Bentley. And he was assisted with G.B. McClure. And there was another man called Dennis Noel Pritt acting as defence. However, the legal technicality of the case actually went wrong and caused it to collapse for a short while. And this is where the photos of the wrong victim were shown. And 3 days later, the complete new legal team, the trial gets back underway. Now, Gordon was said to have shown very little interest during the trial. He's talking really lightheartedly. He's smiling and waving at his wife, and obviously she believed that he was innocent. And the first witness that was called forward was DC Fred Sherrill, and he outlined the fingerprints found at the scene. And with John Plowers on defence, he argued that the print on the tin opener was far too faint to be a definite answer. And Sir Bernard Pillsbury, he then comes forward. He states that Evelyn Oatley's cause of death was the damage to her throat, and at the time estimated to have been around 2 hours before or after 12:30 a.m. So they couldn't give a positive time frame, but it was around 12:30. Now, Felix Samson then comes forward to state that on the night of Evelyn's murder, between 10:30 and 11 p.m, both he and Gordon had actually met two sex workers in Piccadilly Circus. They agreed to go their separate ways with their respective client, and they agreed to meet back at the Monaco restaurant. So Felix goes back at a Monaco restaurant at 11:30, and he waits a further 25 minutes for Gordon, who didn't show up. So Felix goes back to the pub, and still no sign of Gordon. He then goes back to the living quarters at around 6 a.m, and he finds Gordon fast asleep. When Gordon wakes up, Felix asked him what time he'd got back, and Gordon said it was around 3:30 or 4 in the morning. And he adds that the woman that he actually went with didn't satisfy him, so he went and found someone else. On the 27th of April, Gordon then decides to act in his own defence. Very famous example of that would be Ted Bundy. And he denies any involvement, insisting that he'd been in the company of another woman that night. In response to Felix's testimony, Gordon said that he had actually lied when interviewed by Edward Greeno, and he did because Greeno had intimidated him. Gordon then said that he had been really, really drunk that night, and he so drunk that he couldn't recall any time. He added that I had not a watch, and of course in the dark one cannot see public clocks. On the 28th, both counsels then presented closing arguments. Mr. Justice Asquith then gives final instructions, and this lasted for about an hour. And at 4 p.m, the jury then retired to consider their verdicts. And this literally took 35 minutes, which obviously, as we all know, is incredibly quick for these kind of things. The jury come back, they declare Gordon as guilty. And Gordon displayed absolutely no emotion. He just stood there like butter would melt, like nothing was going to affect him. But obviously, understandably, his wife had burst into tears as she believed that he was innocent. When asked if the court should not impose the death penalty, Gordon just basically looked at the judge and said, because I am completely innocent, sir. But again, court didn't believe him, and Gordon is sentenced to death. And he was sentenced to death by hanging. And when imposing this sentence, Mr. Justice Asquith said that Gordon Frederick Cummins, after a fair trial, you have been found guilty. And as you know, there is only one sentence in law which permits me to pronounce. And as you'll be taken from this place to prison and into a place of execution, where you'll be hanged by your neck until you are dead, and may God have mercy on your soul. Now, in starting his sentence, Gordon was held in a condemned cell at HMP Wandsworth, and he voiced absolutely no concerns about his predicament. But he did actually lodge an appeal, and this was rejected in June of 1942. On the 25th of June 1942, this was the day that they chose for Gordon to be hanged. He was executed by a man called Albert Pierrepoint, who was actually the person responsible for hanging Derek Bentley. And it was reported that Gordon was given brandy to calm his nerves. He walks up, he's flanked by two guards, he shows no resistance, and it was said that his execution was carried out within 2 minutes. It's said that his execution was also carried out during a German air raid, and he became the first person to be executed at such an event. And he he protested innocence right up until the end. He was still being supported by his wife and his family, but as was the custom with these death sentences at the time, his body was actually buried within the prison. Now, rumour has it when this sort of thing used to happen, they would then build an officer's mess over it. So this was like a little bar that the prison officers would go to just to obviously de-stress after work or during working hours. And a lot of the prisoners refer to it as dancing over the graves. And I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that's where the term dancing on your grave comes from, was the fact that Officers' Mess was built over the burial site of prisoners who died by execution. Now, the charges relating to the other three Blackout murders remained on the file. Scotland Yard believed that Gordon was responsible for these, but unfortunately they could only secure the conviction for Evelyn Oatley. And although none of the evidence showed that he did kill the two women in October of 1941, they still maintained that he was actually guilty of those. But there was just literally the lack of evidence. Like I said, everything was by paperwork, and they would have to pour through everything. But eventually, they did get their man. It's kind of unfortunate, obviously, only one victim got shown any justice. Obviously, the two women he assaulted, they got their justice, but the rest of the victims, none of them or their families were shown any sort of remorse, any sort of justice at all. And he went to his grave singing his innocence when it was obvious that they found your fingerprints. So I hope this is a case that you guys weren't really aware of. If you were, then feel free to let me know at the bottom. I always read your comments. Just a little add-on. It's a huge thank you to you all. And I will hopefully see you very, very soon for the next true crime story with Silhouette. Take care, and I'll see you soon.